All right, today we're diving into a really challenging theological interpretation from our source material. It's one that completely reframes the conversation around transgender identity within Christianity. It is a pretty complex and, frankly, provocative argument, so let's break down exactly how it builds its case, step by step. So, the entire argument we're about to unpack really kicks off with this one powerful question. It asks all of us to consider a pretty tough possibility. What if, throughout history, the most devout believers, the ones trying their best to defend tradition, were actually the ones who accidentally stood against what God was doing next? And this quote right here, it just captures the whole idea perfectly. It suggests that history is kind of littered with examples where religious certainty becomes a huge blind spot. This whole concept is presented as a really crucial word of caution for the debates that are happening right now.
Okay, so how does this historical pattern hook into today? Well, the source takes this logic and applies it directly to the modern Christian conversation about transgender identity, and it leads to a pretty startling thesis.
And here we are at the core thesis. This interpretation argues that the widespread Christian hostility towards transgender people isn't just some cultural issue, but it's actually a spiritual one. It's framed as a potential deception, something specifically designed to blind believers to a new way that God might be revealing his own nature.
Now, to build this case, the source doesn't turn to modern arguments at all. Instead, it goes way back to a foundational concept in Scripture. You could say this is the theological engine for the entire piece.
You probably know this principle, right? It's straight from the book of Genesis. The idea that in marriage, a man and a woman become one flesh. The source argues this is way more than just a poetic metaphor. It's describing a literal, mystical reality, a pattern that, as we're about to see, repeats itself in some incredibly important ways. So the crucial turning point is right here in Ephesians. The Apostle Paul takes that one flesh idea from Genesis and just elevates it, calling it a profound mystery. And what does it point to? A much bigger reality, the union between Christ and the church. Suddenly, human marriage becomes a symbol for a divine one. And this pattern isn't just a one-off thing. The source shows how it unfolds across Scripture in 3 key levels. First, you've got the human union of man and woman. Then you see the divine union of Christ and the Father. And finally, it all culminates in a final union in Revelation, where the Spirit and the bride literally speak as a single entity. It's framed as this fundamental, repeating truth about how God works. Okay, now we get to the absolute core of the theological argument. This is where the source takes that two become one logic and applies it to the person of Jesus himself. So the interpretation laid out here is that Jesus mystically embodies both masculine and feminine principles. I mean, think about it. Biologically, he's male, but in his relationship to God the Father, he's described as holding a feminine position of submission. At the exact same time, in his divine authority over all of creation, he holds a masculine position. The argument concludes that this creates a mystical integration of both, a concept the source specifically labels a transgender figure. So if Jesus represents one half of this mystical union, what about his counterpart, the bride of Christ? Well, she has to be a perfect complement, right? Let's see how this framework explains her role. The argument here is that the bride perfectly mirrors Jesus' integration. As a biological female, she unites with Christ and receives what the Bible calls the mind of Christ. Now, this theological framework specifically defines that spiritual identity as masculine. So the result is that, just like Jesus, the bride becomes a figure who integrates both feminine and masculine realities into one being. And when you lay it all out like this, you can really see the incredible symmetry the source is describing. On one side, you have a male body with a divine masculine mind, and on the other, a female body that also receives a divine masculine mind. According to this view, they are perfectly matched counterparts, described as two mystical transgender figures who are prepared to become one. So, what's the point of all this deep, complex theology? Well, the source connects it directly back to a very clear warning for Christians in the here and now. Using Jesus' own parable, the source suggests that clinging to old, rigid categories, those are the old wineskins, could be really dangerous. If God is revealing something new about his nature, the new wine, then those old frameworks might not just be inadequate. They might actually burst, causing believers to miss the revelation completely. And this leads us to the final direct challenge. A parallel is drawn between the religious leaders of Jesus' day and believers today. Back then, a man claiming to be God was the ultimate blasphemy, and it led to his rejection. The question being posed here is this: could transgender identity be the modern blasphemy that tests whether the church can recognize God working in an unexpected and maybe even uncomfortable form?
And that brings us to the final provocative question that the entire theological structure has been building towards. It leaves you, the listener, to think about the ultimate implication. If, according to this specific interpretation, the central figures of Christianity are themselves expressions of integrated masculine and feminine realities, then what does it mean to reject that very same concept in other people? It's a challenging question to end on for sure.